Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Soldiers of Cinema podcast. As per usual, we are your hosts for the day, for the episode, for the movie discussion, Cullen and Clark, who is laughing at my vain attempts at doing an intro.
No, it's okay. It's okay. And you know what you guys out there don't know, unless I decide to edit these outtakes into
the blooper reel.
The blooper reel is that this is like Cullen's like third or fourth attempt at an intro today. And
Yes.
no, I find it like particularly endearing and sweet. It's okay, Cullen. But yes, we are your host as always for this show, and we are going to be discussing a movie, and that movie is something that everybody is already aware of because they've seen the title. But why don't you tell them what we're going to discuss? Because it's your pick.
Today we are going to be talking about one of my favorite movies, which was my pick this week, 1999 Stanley Kubrick film, his last film, Eyes Wide Shut, which I think is a really fascinating movie. I think we've both, I'm sure, seen it a few times. So this is neither of our first viewings.
Nope.
But I'm excited. You know, I think that this will be a really fascinating episode because it's a movie that has a lot of kind of discussion and talk around it.
I have seen one or two things in my life, but never anything like this.
Sure, you could. There's a lot of aspects of this film that a person could dive into to discuss. And as with all of Kubrick's films, right? I think that's like one of the reasons that he's gone down, as one of the titans of cinema is that, not only are his films generally pretty entertaining and exciting to watch, but there's a lot of room for interpretation. There's a lot of things to discuss. Sometimes I think people go a little bit overboard and
we'll get into that too,
and really start to go kind of nuts with his films. But yeah, I am first and foremost, I'm surprised a little. I don't know, surprised, but just kind of like, oh, Eyes Wide Shut. I guess I was like, I wouldn't expect this to be one of your favorite films. I don't know why I wouldn't expect it. There's no like real reason for that, but we haven't talked about Kubrick much. I don't guess.
Yeah, I'm surprised that it's taken us 70 odd episodes to get to a Kubrick film too.
I think, and it might just be, I mean, at least from my perspective, it might just be because I do kind of sense that, all of his films, every single one of them have been just, talked about so much and analyzed to such great extent. So I guess from my perspective, I've kind of been like, well, I don't know what could I add to the conversation about this film? And of course, like what we can add mostly is kind of just our own personal experience and take on it. So as we always do, let's start there. I'm really curious to hear about, your viewing experience, like when you kind of first saw this film and what impact it had on you, why you chose it, like all that good stuff. I'm curious to hear. Yeah.
So I think the first time I watched this was probably, I want to say like maybe 5 years ago. So it wasn't that long ago. In the grand scheme of things. And I was one of those movies that I remember watching, and then I think like the next night I watched it again, and not even in a sense of like, oh man, I missed something and I want to go back and see all the clues that I didn't pick up on. More just that I was so kind of like taken in by the atmosphere of the film and just the way that Kubrick kind of lets this story play out is so fascinating to me and so enthralling that I just remember kind of thinking like, oh, what am I going to watch tonight? And nothing really could surpass the feeling of watching this again. So I watched it again. And since then I've seen it a bunch. I find it very like, again, we'll get into this more later, but I do think that I remember when I first saw it thinking that it was kind of funny that people do go on and on about like the conspiracies and all these different things about this movie that kind of surround like the making of it and Kubrick himself and all that.
Which is not unlike almost all of his films, right?
Exactly.
I mean,
like that's
The
Shining,
Shining, 2001. With. I mean,
totally.
It's like a running theme.
But I remember thinking that was like, thinking it was almost odd that I didn't, coming out of it, I didn't really care about any of that stuff. I more cared about like the film itself and how, again, how the story is told, how the like the themes of the story and all this stuff
Mm-hmm.
that are very much on display here. Like
Yeah.
and so I thought that was kind of fascinating. That like
Well,
I
let
don't know.
me
I felt
ask.
like I got some different things than a lot of
Yeah,
people.
let me
So
ask. Let me ask a quick question because you said you'd seen it about 5 years ago. So obviously, I'm curious. What if any baggage did you kind of bring to your first viewing? In other words, film had been out for geez, what if you saw it 5 years ago? It's
I think 20 years at that point it would have been.
almost
Yeah,
it came out in, I think it was released in 99. So
yeah.
yeah, I mean, you're getting close to 20 years since its release, and there's been so much written about it and so much discussion of it, and and there's been all this uh analyzing of it and everything. So I'm curious, like, were you aware of a lot of that, or did you come to it kind of like clean, or I'm just
No,
kind
I
of
think I came to
curious.
it relatively clean. Like I hadn't
Okay.
really like obviously,
Yeah.
you hear talk about it and stuff, but I
Yeah.
think I don't think I'd ever really like read into it much.
Okay.
I never I yeah, I didn't really have
Okay.
much of a preconceived notion as to what the film was
Interesting.
going to be in
And
advance.
and and I'm assuming, of Kubrick's filmography, what had you seen before this? Everything, or is
Pretty
this
much everything.
something?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay,
I
so
think
this was
maybe
like
I
the
hadn't seen Paths of Glory or something, but
okay, okay.
yeah.
So you've seen almost all of his filmography before this point, and okay, interesting. I mean, for me, I saw it on release theatrically. I saw it in a theater when it was released, and so there was, I mean, it was like definitely, especially in '99, cinema was still, kind of a cornerstone of pop culture. This is
Hmm.
before social media. This is before even really DVD to great extent.
Hmm.
And so, theatrically released films were like still, huge, that was a huge part of pop culture.
Hmm.
And people talked about movies, not that they don't now, but I think people get the idea of what I'm trying to suggest is that there was just, so there was a lot more buzz.
Hmm.
Big deal, right? It's Kubrick's film. He had passed away, I'm pretty sure, before it started. It opened theatrically, so he had died. So there's all of this discussion. Of course, Tom Cruise, huge movie star, even back then. I mean, he's been a movie star for like what, 40 years now or something.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
so there's just a lot of weight behind it, right? Heavily promoted. And so I remember watching the film theatrically, and yeah, I mean, it's a pretty intense film. I remember, kind of just vague kind of feelings about my original viewing, because it was so long ago, 25 years almost now. But I mean, I remember, it felt like such a dark, um, just a really dark film. I remember being like unsettled by
Hmm.
it, that it was just like, and I think watching it now, so obviously I've seen it a few times since, and then I watched it last night so that it was fresh for this discussion. And wow, I mean, I feel like even more so now that I'm, 20, 25 years more of life. When I first saw it, I was younger. I was about your age when I first saw it. And now I've got a lot more life under my belt. And, wow, I mean, it's a pretty like dark dive into, a lot of potentially destructive, you know, thoughts, jealousy, and stuff. So yeah, it's an intense film. I remember like it really stuck with me. I went to go see it with a friend of mine at the time, and I think we went and like grabbed some coffee afterwards and talked about it for quite a while, because it is definitely one of those films that kind of gets you thinking.
Hmm.
And so yeah, I'm curious to, this will be an interesting, kind of discussion. And I always find it fascinating. I think this film will be particularly fascinating to kind of, you know, try to kind of like look through your perspective, of being about as old as I was when I first saw it, 25 years ago. It's just, it's always kind of fun to see like generationally, how we might look at this differently
Hmm.
or maybe similarly.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, you mentioned themes, and I think that like the things that kind of stick with me too, like again, jealousy and all that is
Mm,
very on display, and this idea of like, you know, uh, fantasized infidelity versus like actual infidelity, and
mm-hmm.
um, the kind of destructive nature of where that leads. And the other thing too, that it's all like, I think one brilliant thing is that it's all, set over essentially one night. And
Or a
as
couple,
the
right? I think a couple, but basically,
yeah,
yeah.
well, but the whole, like, the bulk of the, they're at the party, and then he has to go to the doctor's call, and then he ends up walking
Yeah.
around. He's at the orgy, and all that takes place in ultimately one night. And much like the novella that it's based off of, which is, I think, appropriately titled Dream Story, and that it follows kind of a similar trajectory to that. But I think that one of the things that makes that so good is, or really what kind of draws me into the movie with that, is just how much of a whirlwind it feels like. Like, again, when I say that I don't really, or at least when I first saw it, I wasn't really like caught up in the whole, like, the theories and the, like, film discussion about, like, what does this mean and what does that mean, that I was more caught up in the really emotional kind of side of the film.
Yeah.
Is that, like, I feel like we've all had those nights where, not anything like this, but where you just are even just...
I was about to say, wait a minute.
Yeah, we've all
Cullen,
had nights like
I
this,
don't know
right?
if we've all had those nights.
But where you're just out, like, it's like 3 or 4 in the morning, and you're still out or something, and you've been out, and you've been at, like, bars or something with friends, and then you just end up, like, there's this kind
and now
of
you're headed to get some
bizarre,
poutine.
like, exactly, you got to go get the street
If you're in
poutine.
Toronto.
And where it just ends up being like you've kind of broken into this otherworldly, that's that, like, 3 to 5 a.m. where it feels very dreamlike, and that's kind of what this movie feels like to me. Is this?
I mean,
like,
it completely feels like a dream. Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. And generally speaking, I mean, I love films that embrace a dreamlike logic, right?
Yeah.
Or that kind of move away from the literal and move towards the symbolic. Which, I mean, I have a tendency to see basically all films in that regard. I mean, even films that seem to be on the surface, very literal. Very, like, quote unquote rational in how the story kind of develops and unfolds and resolves. And from a, like, writing perspective too, I'm really challenged by trying to write scripts that are really, this happens, then this happens, then this happens, kind of a really rational linear story. So my brain just tends to kind of go to that place anyway. And I really enjoy how this film totally embraces that, just the dreamlike logic of this world. I mean, because there's a lot of stuff that's just, like, obviously plumb ridiculous, right? If this were in the real world. And I just want to take, like, a small digression, because I found this, like, pretty funny. And I think this might come from maybe, like, the origins of the original novella that was actually, written quite long ago, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I think it's the mid-20s, yeah.
It is the idea that, so Tom Cruise's character in this story is a doctor. And we get to see a little bit of him working in his office, and it seems like he's like a general practitioner even. It doesn't even seem like he's not, like, it's not like he's a brain surgeon.
Yeah.
Or, I mean, he's, there's, like, this old, like, elderly, I don't know if it was a man or a woman, but, he's just, like, checking out their foot,
He's like a physician, yeah.
No, he's just like a general practitioner doctor, like a family physician. But yet, it's like everywhere he goes, he's like, I'm a doctor, you
he pulls it out like
in.
Columbo in the badge, right?
Or the fact that, like, somehow that he would be peripheral to this kind of, like, power, right? Yeah. Yeah. Because he's a general practitioner doctor, of course, and my wife is a surgeon, right? So it's funny. It makes me crack up because I'm like, oh boy, the real life of a physician is nowhere, Anyway, I digress. But that might be kind of the, maybe when this book was written, maybe there was a little more, like, elevated status to being a physician, perhaps. I'm not sure.
Well, I think that Kubrick definitely does have a sense of humor about these things too, because just again the way that he pulls out his doctor's little certificate as though he's like a cop.
Yeah. That's what I mean.
Very, very funny.
It is very funny. And again, I just got done saying I'm not looking at the film in a literal sense like this, but it is kind of funny to just, because I think if you do start to look at this film literally, which, a lot of people do, and you talked a little bit about conspiracy theorists and And I don't want to get too much into that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But when people start to look at it more literally, I think it kind of, frankly, it falls apart. Because really where this film succeeds is in this dreamlike logic where things, I think, are meant to be seen so much more symbolically. The
Yeah.
themes are supposed to be seen. I mean, supposed to be. I think, what the hell do I know? But imagining myself as like Kubrick and knowing his other films seems to me that he's, his mind is kind of given to that way of seeing the world as well. Anyway,
Well, even in the way that every, like, it seems like the interactions that they both, Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman, who were of course married at the time, every interaction
which I want to
they
talk
have
about
with
more
another
later.
person in this movie seems like it is a dream interaction, whether it's
None of this is
her
realistic in
dancing
any
with
way.
the Hungarian at the party, or him talking to the two models, or
None of
the
this
prostitutes that he talks to,
makes
and it's
sense.
like it honestly reminds me, and obviously this is not the case, but what it reminds me of is when you're like playing a video game or something, and it's like an open world game, and every time you walk into a location, every character like has something specific to say to you,
Yeah.
and it's like they've been waiting and they're scripted in this way, and they come over, and that is a very dreamlike feeling.
No, I
where
totally
it's like
agree.
everyone has some sort of like bizarre piece of information or something to give to these main characters whenever they set foot in a location.
That's
right?
a great analogy. No, that's a really interesting way to look at it. And again, I'm totally fine with that, right? I mean, I don't need or often even want my films to have to adhere to the realities of what our day-to-day life is. I think that's ridiculous. They can be as abstract, they can be as symbolic, impressionistic, whatever word you want to use. That's the full right to take whatever poetic license you want. But yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I mean, if we look at this on that very basic level, it's like, none of these characters are people in any real sense of the term at all, right? None of these characters, we don't know anything hardly about them. We don't know anything about the relationship between, very little, and that's okay, because I think it's meant to be an exploration of the human psyche, and how a person can go down a very like dark path, like you had kind of mentioned with jealousy. I think it's interesting in the way that it kind of explores, maybe peripherally, but I think importantly, how to really love someone, to be close to someone, and to build a life with someone, your significant other. You do really kind of have to you have to make yourself so vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it is like the ultimate vulnerability to be in love with someone and to share your life with them. And these are things I know now that I didn't know when I first saw this film, by the way. Like, this is how my viewing has kind of changed, my understanding of these themes. You have to make yourself so profoundly vulnerable. I mean, you are literally putting like your life, your emotional life, even your physical life in the hands of another person, right? They have a profound amount of power over you. And so that I think, a lot of people struggle with a great fear of making themselves that vulnerable. And I think if you were to go down a dark path of jealousy or of fear in what could happen to you if someone abused that vulnerability and that intimacy, I think is why a lot of people have problems with intimacy in relationships. Is because it takes a tremendous amount of courage.
Well, I think something too that I think you mentioned that is really interesting is the like, when I look at this movie and think about jealousy, it's not just like the basic level of like, oh, I'm of jealousy of even the dream affair that she has with the soldier. What I think is an interesting twist on this, and something that I actually relate to greatly, is that he, to start, isn't a jealous person, and like you can tell that he even has that monologue where he's saying like, like, you're my wife, obviously I trust you. And the reason I say that it's personal, because I'm very much like that as well in relationships. Like, I'm not a very jealous person. I don't really care about things like talking to other people, or if someone comes up and flirts with my significant other, and I have the trust in my significant other to not reciprocate, obviously, and that's never really been an issue for me. But I think one thing that's really interesting is the moment that snaps, that
Mm.
because like when you have someone who isn't jealous, who suddenly snaps in and isn't used to those feelings, and so you see this like spiral
Mm.
downward that
Mm-hmm.
Tom Cruise goes through in this, which I think is really really fascinating. And it also is something that really inspired me for the, like, I think going to a personal level like that and seeing kind of like, well, so when I was writing, which I still am writing, my third feature, which is kind of like an erotic thriller, very much tonally inspired by this.
Mm-hmm.
Um, one of the things, like one of the goals that I set myself as I wrote it, and as I have continued to write it, is taking anything that I feel vulnerable about and turning it up to 11, or any
Mm.
aspect of my personality that I feel like could
Yeah.
result in something negative, and
Leaning into it.
heightening it to a
Yeah.
degree that like I know I would never get to, but
Right.
what if
It's
I
an
did? Like
exploration.
what if that happened? And so I
Yeah.
think that that's something that's really fascinating, is
Yep.
taking this thing where it's like you push someone who is very confident in themselves to a level where now they've spiraled out of that, and it's like they're
Yeah.
completely drowning in these feelings that they thought that they had complete control over. So
Yeah.
that's really what I find really fascinating about
Because
this
he really
movie.
does lose control, right? I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah.
his wife in real life and in the film, and I think that's very interesting. By the way, the Kubrick cast, Tom Cruise and Kidman. I think that's
Yeah.
such an interesting aspect of this film, because obviously there's all of it brings so much interesting baggage
Hmm.
into the film, whether it's Tom Cruise and the fact that he's a movie star and he's always this hyper confident, right, in control person, both in his films and seemingly, at least, his image
Hmm.
as a person, right, as a celebrity, as a star. And of course, Kidman in her own right, successful actress by this point, but they're in this, high powered, mega marriage. And to cast them both in this
Hmm.
role is so intriguing to me, and I think very effective. And you're right. It's interesting you talk about this point where Cruz's character breaks, and we see him handle this horribly. By the
Hmm.
way, I
Yeah.
mean horribly. He goes down like about the worst path almost that you could imagine somebody could go down. So I kind of your idea of like taking a fear or a weakness or kind of a shadow aspect of the human condition and kind of cranking that up to 11. I mean, obviously it could always be you could always imagine more his character could have done in response,
Hmm.
but I mean basically his wife expresses a fantasy infidelity to him, and he's so shaken by this, it so knocks him off center that he goes through this huge journey uh to find where he's like veers into infidelity in real life in
Hmm.
response to this fantasy infidelity. So there's interesting questions of like um you know what we think, the things that we think, the things that we imagine, are they as significant as things that actually happen in the real world? And the consequences, can they be? It's a question I think the film asks. Can the consequences of an imagined incident, something that happens in a fantasy, can they be as significant as the consequences of actions that happen in the physical life? I think it's
Hmm.
also interesting, thinking about obsession. Tom Cruise's character obviously goes to a place of of jealousy and then obsessing over this fantasy that his wife has told him about.
Hmm.
And it makes me wonder too about Kubrick and his obsession with his films. I mean, it seems like, again, I don't know the man, I never knew him or anything, but it seems like he maybe had a predisposition, to be obsessed with his work. I
Hmm.
think that'd probably be a pretty fair, easy thing to say. And he's kind of creating fantasies, right? Like these are stories. These aren't things that are really happening. He's kind of imagining these things, and then he's making them tangible in a sense, in a way to communicate these fantasies via the art of film. And I just think it's like extremely fascinating. All of these things kind of like smush together in ways that aren't really easy to like unravel or
Hmm.
even dissect or even kind of like articulate, I think that you said that one of your first impressions was just that you had a really like emotional response to the film, and I feel like it is a film that elicits a pretty strong emotional response, I think, and could be like quite scary, frankly, and
Yeah.
unpleasant in a lot of ways. I mean, to me at least, like it's there's a lot of aspects of this that are really unpleasant because it really goes to some dark places, I think. But it's an exceptionally effective film in that
Well, I think
regard.
that's also why I think Cruise is such perfect casting here, because I know that Kubrick, he considered Baldwin, like Alec Baldwin and Kim Basinger, like he was clearly going for
Boy, what a
a
different
real
movie that would
couple.
have been.
That would have been, yeah, very different. Would have been like Notting Hill too. But I think Cruise really, really works here because, like you said, where Cruise puts on this persona and his public image is so like catered and controlled by him to this idea of like a person in control of their emotions, of every aspect of the films and the productions that they make and beyond.
Yeah.
And you take that, and I think Kubrick was brilliant in the casting here because this is so unlike any other Cruise role in that it's so rare to see him completely out of control.
Out of control.
Where
That's a great point.
You have
Yeah.
him like basically flailing to get what he wants this entire movie and completely unable to get it. Like he how many situations does he show up in this film where he is clearly looking to have an affair and to have a sexual encounter and just is completely incapable of
I don't
going
even
through
know
with it or doing it or even exploring it, right? Like,
well, and that's a good point, but another way to look at it too. I mean, I don't even know if it's clear that he actually is looking for that. I think that he's looking for. I mean, again, there's a lot of ways you can interpret it, but the way I kind of saw it was not so much like he's looking to like consummate an affair. It's that he is like trying to find some control. Like the vulnerability, like, and make some assumptions. He loves his wife, like he's built this life with her. They have a daughter, like that there is genuine, intimacy and love there. I'm going to assume that. Okay. Even though the film doesn't really do a lot to set that up, to be honest. Because like as soon as we start, she's flirting with the Hungarian guy. He's flirting with these two other women. I mean, to be fair, they don't show a lot of like closeness and warmth and intimacy with these two characters from the get-go. So maybe I'm wrong about this, but let's just say that it is the case that they have a close relationship. I mean, I think like he's but maybe not. I don't know. But he's clearly so thrown by and so threatened. I think threatened is really the word here. He's so threatened by his wife's admission of this fantasy. And that I think he's actually trying to find control is what I feel like he's trying to find, or trying to conquer that feeling of fear and that feeling of being threatened, of being thrown away, of not being in control, of not being the center all the time of his wife's life. And so I think that's what because there were so many opportunities that he could have cheated on her, but he's easily taken away from these situations.
Yes,
right?
Yeah. Like she calls him and he leaves.
I mean,
right?
it's like he's looking for just please, saved by the bell, please save me,
absolutely. Yeah.
And so I think it's maybe a little bit more about trying to find like ownership of, he feels totally unmoored and he feels completely at the mercy of another person. And he's really obviously extremely uncomfortable with being at the mercy of another person. And that vulnerability, I think, is scary. Anyway, but that's just one other layer.
But no, I totally,
I think that that's, in there.
Yeah, like that's kind of what I meant in that he's not necessarily approaching all these situations as like, I'm going to have a sexual affair.
Yeah.
And that's my goal. It's exactly like you said, where there's this control, but I think another level of insecurity there is the insecurity with being unable to do it, like that he is so unsure of himself, and with that control that he's like, that you can just tell that as he because he keeps going to these things, right? Like he continually is seeking these things out.
Well, I almost feel like you're right, like the flailing
Yeah.
imagery, I think, is like where he's just kind of falling deeper into this pit.
Yeah.
And he's just
Yeah.
kind of like flailing, and so he's kind of just grabbing on to the like whatever because it's like a lot of these circumstances, everything is like happening to him. He's not like seeking these things out. It's like the
Yes, yeah,
prostitute
yeah. And
on the
he's very
street
clearly
corner.
like uncomfortable at the orgy. Like you can
Yeah,
see his eyes, the expression in his eyes is very
yeah.
clearly
This,
like, what the hell is going on?
yeah, and I think it's like the prostitute encounter that he has. She comes up to him, like
Yeah.
she seduces him. Um, it's he's not like going out to the it's like things are happening to him. I
Yeah.
feel
Yeah.
like more so than the other way around.
Oh,
And so I
absolutely. Yeah,
and so I
yeah.
that's where I feel like that flailing, right? Where it's just like he's in a free fall is kind of the way it feels.
Well, and
And
it's like even just in the like when he is actually interrogated at the orgy near the end of it,
mm,
and they're like, take off your clothes, and it's like he's just walked through a room of like hundreds of people, having sex in front of him naked,
hmm
and he's like, I'm not taking my clothes off. Like, are you crazy? And it's like this very funny thing where it is very, I mean, obviously it's a different room and everyone else is clothed at that point and looking at him, but I do think that moment where he's like so hesitant to display any sort of vulnerability in that sense,
hmm
like he's taking the mask off, but he is refusing to go any further.
yeah,
And he is saved by a nude woman,
yeah.
immediately afterwards. The woman comes in and she's completely naked. But you get this sense that it's like, even from the beginning, that he has this aspiration of a higher kind of more noble status in society. And I think that's also one of the reasons that perhaps the
Yeah,
decision is made to make him like a GP, where it's like it's not a super,
yeah,
like, not I don't mean noble in a sense that like GPs
yeah.
aren't
No,
like
no, no.
great people, but just that
Yeah,
it's not like
it's not
neurosurgery, right? It's
prestigious.
not.
Yeah, it's not as
um
prestigious. Yeah,
and so but you have this thing where he like orbits all of these things. Like he goes to this party put on by these very wealthy socialites that he knows nobody at, and
yeah.
is constantly, even in the billiards room at the end, where he's sitting there and trying to kind of maintain this level of like, yeah, we're on the same page, until Sidney Pollack is just like, cut the shit. Like, we're, like, I know
You're
where
not.
you were. I'm like,
You,
you were, you stuck out like a sore thumb.
yeah, you're
You have
not
to
on the same
understand
page,
that this
dude.
is not the world that you are in. Like, you may orbit it to a level, but you cannot break into this world. You are not on that level. And it's this whole thing where it's like this level of, it does both humiliate him, but also really humbles him. And I think that is ultimately how the film resolves itself, and I think a really, really great way,
Mm,
which is that it's almost this commentary on just like, yeah, this, you can flail and you can try and climb these mountains as much as possible to get to a different, stratosphere or whatever, and yet at the end of the day, are you forsaking what you have already and like what you were happy
mm,
with already
mm.
for that stuff that is completely superfluous to your life? And
Well,
so I
and
find that like
even
a really interesting commentary.
yeah, and to take that a little further, I mean, you're right. I think there are some interesting aspects of this in the film as well. It's there's definitely class is a bit a part of this. Aspiring to a higher level of class. It's interesting that when they're in their home, it's a nice home. It's not extraordinarily extravagant, but it is a very nice
So yeah,
apartment
it's like a nice
for New
apartment
York
condo.
for
Yeah.
New York City. So they're clearly w- well off, like upper middle class kind of in the United States as far as economy goes. But you see such a huge divide between that and like actual upper class when they go to this party.
Hmm.
Now we are in this huge mansion, but it's just like filled with sharks. Like
Yeah.
everything that happens to them, it's like they've just gone into the shark tank, and it's
Yeah.
like everybody is out to get you. It seems like, right? I mean, it's like Nightingale and Cruz and Kidman, their characters are like little minnows in this piranha tank or whatever. And I mean, it's like the Hungarian character is basically preying on Kidman.
Hmm.
The two women who take Cruz's arms and are leading him through the house, they're like preying on him, right? I mean, it's like talk about like out to get you, and then of course, Cruz is called upstairs, right? And the host, the guy that he knows, is there with like a dying woman, you know, And clearly this man is cheating on his wife, Sidney Pollack's character, right? Because
Yeah,
we've just
yeah.
been introduced to his wife, and even in the Sidney Pollack is like, weighing Kidman up and down, like
Yeah,
right
and
as
his wife is even like, he says that to every woman that comes in here. Like,
and
yeah.
but so it's like everybody's a predator. Like every character that we get to experience,
Hmm.
right? That we get to see is a predator,
Yeah.
basically. So so it's like going into this world. Do you yeah, do you really want to go into this world, and at what cost would you
Hmm.
be going into this world? And so it's kind of another shade of interpretation where it's like, boy, this is a whole different ball game you're entering. This is
Yeah.
not the same arena that you're used to playing in. Like this is
Well, and I
uh
wonder too, like, because you made the point earlier about Kubrick, the obsession that Kubrick has with his own movies and stuff like that, and I wonder how
yeah.
much of the portrayal of this is also so linked to just like the film industry in general, where I
Mm,
recall, like, again, this is all stuff that I'm certainly not a part of, but certainly have orbited and seen, like whether it was working at TIFF or
mm,
like friends of mine who have had pretty successful like film deals recently, and seeing how they navigate that sort of thing, and
yeah.
again, those sharks that come out at
Yeah.
these like industry events and things like that, where it is so dog eats dog. Like, it is incredible how people will drop any notion of like, or any semblance of human relationship to get ahead and to get up that food chain. And I
Ah,
find that very fascinating. And you
yeah.
see, again, the film isn't necessarily directly about that kind of like, it's not like a triumph story of like, oh, I'm gonna like break out of my chains and become rich with this idea or whatever.
No.
But at the same time, it definitely deals with the themes of like, yeah, those classes, those like different stratospheres of, again, I've known people who have been very wealthy and have seen their lives and things like that, and it's always interesting. But then you meet someone like you said, who is just on a whole other level of wealth, where like money's not even a conversation, like it's not even a
Mm.
question, it's not even an aspect of life, because it's just
Well,
a constant. And it's a very interesting thing how you can have like these levels of wealth that people don't even really realize
and
are
I think it's just to play with that a little bit too. I mean, I think what one of the things Kubrick has done here is that he's kind of where in most films, I think you could have a story where these characters would be abusing or expressing their power in other ways with money economically
yeah, yeah,
to these outsider characters. And I think what Kubrick has done is he's kind of turned that expression of power in his story into sex.
yeah, into the most
Um,
vulnerable, one of the most vulnerable aspects of
in
people's
right
lives. Yeah,
into sex, and because I think a lot of times, because we've seen many stories where you have kind of a character that's kind of from a different socioeconomic world, and then there's this like somehow they are on the periphery, but then kind of get invited in a little way to this whole other stratosphere of economic
yeah,
power, and they get manipulated economically. Generally they're exploited economically, and I think what you see here, and I'm just totally kind of thinking of this as we go here, as you talk and I riff off of that, is that it does seem that there's a sexual exploitation that's actually happening. So they're obviously very wealthy people, but they're like expressing their power over these outsiders, um, basically sexually.
hmm,
Like, oh, you're married or I don't care. These rules don't apply to me. Look how fancy it's like the power of having no consequences, right? Almost, or just, I'm gonna. So it's interesting that Kubrick is like kind of turned that a little bit and focused it, like you said, I think, to even a more intimate, like even a more scary expression
yeah.
of someone having that kind of power over
Hmm.
you, right? Um,
And
it's
that's one of the
extremely effective, because it's extremely effective. I just because it's like, this movie is really unsettling,
hmm,
and I think that's a big part of it. That expression of power through that, like this. I mean, just it's like at that first party. Just the way that these characters are just kind of just so flagrantly, um, yeah, almost consuming. Nicole Kidman and Tom Cruise, or trying to. It's just, yeah, it's unsettling.
Well, it's one of the reasons that I also find like very, very literal interpretations of this film kind of boring.
Yeah.
Because it does kind of miss to me like the whole point of, like you said, where Kubrick is exploring the like exploitation here in the most vulnerable human way you can. And so to turn that conversation into like like an Illuminati conspiracy or something like that, just kind of it does bore me a little bit, because I'm just kind of like, it seems like you are throwing out so much of the subtext of the film to just look at the very surface level like visual symbolism of like elements of the film. So, but I do actually, let's talk a little bit about the like the look of the film too. Like, so because the film was primarily shot on a soundstage, with exception to like some like B unit New York exteriors, but
I mean,
but like rear projection, and they built like a New York backlot in the UK, which is why the streets are so clean.
Well, I mean, I think, to tie it into theme, I think it plays extremely well into the the dreamlike state that this film, the kind of the dreamlike logic. This film has this kind of nightmarish quality, this kind of surreal quality. I think all these things work really well. To work well toward that end, because it's like, you can recognize the rear projection pretty. I mean, there's the scene of Tom Cruise walking down the sidewalk, and it's clear he's
people always riff on that,
and they do, and I don't mind it. I'm not bringing it up because I mind it. I actually like it. I think, and you can tell.
No, I like it too. Yeah,
you can very clearly tell it's a black lot. Like, this is very obvious. There's even a lot of, when they're in their apartment, I mean, if you just happen to just glance out the window, you can very clearly tell that this is a set on a sound stage. Who cares? I don't care about any of that. I think it works great. I mean, Kubrick, and you talk about kind of an outsider, and you wonder if Kubrick is also kind of, maybe subconsciously even kind of injecting some of his, he's an outsider working in Hollywood, a lot of like jousting for power and control and, all these kind of things. So maybe there's some of that. But I think this is one of the ways that Kubrick kind of protected himself from that machine,
Well, I even think that going back to what we kind of talked about, where it's like it feels almost like, I described it sort of like a video game, where it's like, I think that the fact that if this was shot really on location in New York, I think you would lose a lot of this feeling that like, it's almost like he's like a mouse in a maze, like that. Like all this stuff is set up for him. All these interactions feel set up like intentional and placed there for him to run into, and it's this really interesting, uncanny feeling. And even that moment that like the when he's walking and it's very clearly rear projection, he's very clearly walking on a track. Like, I love that, because that moment in itself feels like he is disassociating with the world.
Yeah,
and it works really well.
It does. That's a great point.
And even
I love that.
I noticed that even in even that like B unit stuff, because of course Kubrick didn't shoot any of the exteriors in New York himself, so it was a B unit that went to get like the shots of the taxis driving down the street and stuff like that. But you can tell that it's so shallow that really in those moments only the taxi is in focus and everything else is kind of beyond focus, which is sort of an unusual thing to do for like establishing shots like that.
Usually you'd have this epic, like, established this wider
and you'd want to
shot,
see everything and have it in focus and all that. And but the fact that it's not would suggest again that like it's very intentional that
isolating.
You have
it's
a plane of existence that these characters are existing on beyond a background that is
well, they're kind of in a snow globe
from them.
Or like you say, it's kind of like a video game, and but in my mind, it's I mean, it's I like that you. Oh, geez, what word did you just use that I really disassociated? It's like he is totally disassociated from his world. I mean, he's in this almost like, like a disassociative state, right? Where he's just totally fallen off the deep end. He's doing things that I would imagine his character would have never done prior to this event. He's going into this world that is so unreal. And like, I agree with you that to interpret this literally, I mean, I think it's just that it's this heightened depersonalization or dehumanization of all of these characters, right? Of this, at the, what was the house where they have the orgy,
Somerton,
like, it's everybody's in these grotesque masks, and it's all of the people at that party are dehumanized
Yeah.
and disassociated from their humanity. And I think that's, represents like his, I guess, bottoming out of this, like he's disassociated from his previous life, from his own self, from his own values. Um, and kind of all of these characters, the people who are already there, where that's their home, they're completely disassociated from their humanity.
Yeah. No, exactly. And it's I don't know, I think it's like super I think it takes a lot of skill as a filmmaker too to take something like this, the subject matter like this, and to present this story in a way that's not like it is definitely it's an uncomfortable film, and it's
Yeah.
there's a lot of disturbing material, but it's not off-putting in a sense that like I don't want like I feel like this is being made from a very human perspective.
Yeah.
And I think that that's where its strength lies, is that it the entire time I sort of feel like Kubrick is not trying to um, make you so disgusted and feel alien in a sense.
No.
It's almost making you like look inward on yourself, which can be
Yeah.
uncomfortable in a different way. But it's not
Yeah.
off-putting. It's not. It's not. Whereas I think that there's a lot of movies that are similar to this that deal with, and especially I actually find like a lot of prestige TV
Mm.
deals with like um, whether it's sexual like nature and things like that, like the human sexuality and things like that, in a sense that is totally off-putting in this weird
Mm.
way where it's like
Can you give
it's
me an
like
example? Like, I'm
well, so like I
curious.
watched a show recently called The White Lotus,
Okay.
which
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah,
so
yeah.
yeah,
I think there's a couple seasons,
yeah, there's two
right?
seasons,
Which
and
one?
one thing
Okay.
I noticed, which I think that like the the quality of the show otherwise aside, I noticed that there was just one thing that stuck out to me, that has stuck out to me as a lot of TV does these days,
Mm.
and film too. Like this is not a TV only thing, but
Yeah.
where sexuality in this way, in Eyes Wide Shut, the sexuality is used as a vulnerable state. It is used as like Kubrick is showing us as like a very human point of view, and what happens when that is twisted and extorted and used.
Perverted.
And
When
so
that's,
and
yeah.
exactly. And so
Yeah.
it's not deeming sexual desire as a negative. It's just showing that it is a vulnerability to a
Yeah.
lot of people.
And
Whereas I
if
find that a
that's,
lot of
yeah.
television, like especially in The White Lotus, sexuality was used in that more so as this like sort of grotesque thing where it's like a character that wants something sexually ends up being punished.
Mm.
Characters who are hypersexual in it, they are the ones that are they are exploited for sure, but they are exploited solely because of the hypersexuality and not as
Hmm.
a like a recourse for something else. And so I find it really fascinating that you could so easily slip into this thing where it almost becomes like this, not like, I don't know if Puritan is the right word, but
Hmm.
I don't see this film. This film isn't like, anti-sex to me as
Yeah.
so much I find, but I find actually a lot of media is these days, interestingly, where it's like it almost is, it's like getting back to this like 80s slasher film where it's like the sexuality is always punished, right? Like that what's the first
Interesting.
couple that dies is the couple that goes off and has sex, and it's like a, don't have sex
Sure,
kids
sure.
kind of thing.
Sure,
So
sure. Like the
I
Friday
find
the
that that's
13th, all
really
those
a
original.
fascinating thing that a lot of television and film, contemporary television and film, try to explore, but in this very bizarre, almost puritanical point of
That's
view.
interesting. I've seen The White Lotus, but it has been a while, and I have to admit I don't remember a tremendous amount about it. I'm trying to
Mhm.
kind of recall my like feelings about it. I mean, I have to say I'm not a huge fan of that show, and I don't want to make this
Yeah,
episode. I
I
don't want to
wasn't
go
either.
too
Yeah,
far
yeah.
off. I wasn't a huge fan of it. I I don't know. Yeah, I. That's interesting. That's an
Yeah, and it's
interesting
definitely
take, though.
season 2. The only
Yeah.
reason it's on my mind is because I actually watched it recently. But season 2 is, I would say, more in line with what I've been saying than season
Yeah.
1. Like season 2 deals with a lot of sexual elements a lot more openly. But no, it's just, yeah, that's just one example of many things. I think that there's a lot of different media that's come out recently that kind of deals with
Well,
sexuality in that
the,
way,
the
which I
one thing
find
that I
fascinating.
the one thing that I'll add, what I can kind of remember is that I think like you talk about how you feel like this film is very like deeply human, and that it's not being nonchalant with the topic of like physical intimacy and
Yeah,
the
yeah.
emotional vulnerability that should go with that. I mean, I think, ideally, in a healthy relationship,
Hmm.
at least in my opinion on that. And I think, like you said, you spoke really well, articulated really well about how, he kind of illustrates, or you could interpret that film as kind of showing what a like perversion of that, or like a shadow side of that could kind of be psychologically, right? And the one thing I'll say is that I think a lot of like modern television, I don't know, maybe I fall into some of this pure Puritan like viewpoint thing that you're talking about, but it's like, not that sex is bad, but that it is significant,
Hmm.
that it's substantial, and a recognition that there is like a psychological weight, and that physical intimacy and emotional intimacy are, I think that it's that emotional intimacy part and that vulnerability part that I think a lot of like current television actually misses
Hmm.
any
Yes.
any kind of grappling with, whatever way that you want to interpret it. But I mean, I think there's just this almost omission of that emotional vulnerability and the
Yeah.
psychological vulnerability and intimacy. And I think that's one of the things that this film is kind of admitting and kind of grappling with in a way that like the Lotus stuff does not. It almost is like cynical in a way
Oh,
about
absolutely. Very cynical. Yeah.
about physicality, in that it's like a tool, it's like a pastime, it's like a video game, it's like a, it's just, or even kind of, so in almost a weird way, it's almost like the way physical intimacy is represented in those films is more hollow and meaningless than in Eyes Wide Shut.
Well, and I think it also goes like there's a whole lot of online discussion too about the necessity of sex scenes in film and things
Mm,
like that these days, and it's been a topic of conversation for like 3 years because there isn't a lot anymore. Like the sex
mm,
scene as a thing in film has kind of gone the way of the dodo as of recently,
yeah.
in the last decade or so. And so there's a lot of like, especially from like younger Gen Z people, there's a lot of discussion about like, well, it's because sex scenes are so totally unnecessary and they're never, and like I think that the like superhero movies have been a big part of that too, because
Mm,
we've got these very like sexless, relationshipless heroines and heroes that
yeah.
just
Well,
save the day, and they
they're
have
not
they have like
humans. They're not. Yeah.
sitcom relationships between each other, and that's as
Right.
deep as it gets.
Yeah.
um, and I think that it's really fascinating to hear people sort of say like, oh, well, a sex scene is never necessary, there's always better ways to, but it's like, I think that that's such a bizarre way of thinking about it, because, and I think that that directly relates to how sex is portrayed when it is portrayed in media nowadays, where, like you said, cynical, like that there always is this kind of weird like negative spin on it, where it either results in negative consequences or it
Hmm.
is shown as this kind of cynical, like a abuse of power or something like that. Whereas
Yeah.
something that is completely non-existent in media today is like Top Gun. Like you think of like the sex scene in Top Gun, which is just I
I
think a
have no
great
memory of
moment.
that. I
Oh,
don't
it's
even
great.
know.
It's
Yeah. I
great.
can't, okay.
Silhouettes, and they shot it in like a day
Wait.
in a
The
hotel room or something.
the
But
the original Top Gun or the
yeah,
new one?
original Top Gun.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. But
I'd
there
have
you
to
go.
go
Like the
back and
original
watch
Top
that.
Gun has this very like steamy sex scene, and the
Yeah.
new Top
Well,
Gun
it's
doesn't
Tony
have that at
Scott.
all,
Of
right?
course it does. It's
Yeah,
Tony Scott.
exactly.
Of
It's
course.
and
I
it,
mean, dude,
but I think that that's
every
interesting
scene is
though.
a sex scene for Tony
Yes.
Scott.
Yeah, yeah,
Whether
yeah.
it's like an F-14 Tomcat or it's like dudes playing volleyball, like
Yeah,
every
everything is
scene was a sex
hypersexual.
scene for Tony Scott.
But I think that it's interesting that you just have lost in media these days that like a genuinely positive sex scene. Like it is kind
Yeah.
of a bizarre
Oh,
thing
yeah.
that has kind of left pop culture altogether.
That's
And
interesting.
again, and you look at, like you said, like you look at the original Top Gun versus Top Gun that just came out, Maverick.
Yeah.
Note that that movie's a very sexless movie. Like, of course, he like him and Jennifer Connelly have a relationship, but there's no like real like sexual element to their relationship that is
Yeah.
shown on screen. And so I do find it really fascinating that this movie, and I think that that's one thing that I think has fascinated me recently a lot, is just like, why is that the case? And I
Hmm.
there's, I'm not going to obviously come to a conclusion here, but I think they're interesting and important conversations, especially relating to a movie like this that deals with
Yeah.
sexuality in such a non-cynical way. Like this movie again is opening up a lot of conversations about like vulnerability and again that perversion and things like that, but it's
Yeah.
not cynical in a way that's like, oh, this is what it's always going to be like, or this is just what
Yeah,
the
I
world is
agree. It's
like. And
not.
yeah,
It's scary. It's dark. It's unsettling, but it's not cynical because
and it
yeah.
feels like necessary, like it feels like
Hmm.
a necessary introspection more
Yeah.
so than
You,
a like cheap use
you
of
know,
the
I
sexual elements.
I haven't given it's interesting. I just start to think a little bit, and we'll come back. We're like, it's okay, it's a digression. This is good, but we'll come back a bit to the film in a sec after this, I think. But it's you bring an interest, you raise an interesting hypothesis or question or kind of observation, and I'll try to pay a little more attention to that. That I think in the 80s, I'll riff on this for just a second. I feel like in the 80s you had like studio mandated, like, okay, we need to have like a certain level of like female nudity, and it was
Hmm.
always just female nudity, and we need to have kind of like maybe like a little steamy sex scene here, but it was like purely kind of like for marketing, right? I mean, it was
Hmm.
like it was often like clearly or like the conversation for no reason whatsoever has to take place in a strip club, and the establishing shot is like a woman spinning around a pole.
Yeah, yeah,
And,
yeah,
and I feel like that was a lot of stuff that was in the 80s, at least that I remember as a kid, and it had like no bearing on character most of the time, no bearing on the story often. It was like, and that was like the epitome of cynical. It's like
yeah, yeah.
100% put in here so that like you know um sell
Sex
few more
sells.
tickets. Right,
Yeah.
right. And but it was always one-sided. It was always for the men. It was
Yes.
always a
Yeah.
naked woman. And so I think and so I don't know, but as I just imagine, we move away from that. So the pendulum kind of swings away from that, which I think is a good thing, because I don't think those make that kind of nudity makes films better. I don't
No. Yeah.
personally
Yeah.
think. Um, and so maybe we haven't found like a healthy place with that
Hmm.
in mainstream movies. I don't know. I'll have to think about this more and kind of look at it. Um, but maybe that's part of it, is that maybe we've moved away from something, and we have to, and the pendulum has to kind of like find a new balance or something.
Yeah.
It's an
Yeah.
interesting question. It's a really interesting question. Also, taste change, which is, culturally, we're in a totally different culture now in a lot of ways than we were in the 80s or 70s.
Hmm.
Um, so this is, I'm not a scholar in this area, but it's a super interesting question, and yeah, I'll have to give this some more thought. That's a
Hmm.
really interesting observation. Um, but back to Eyes Wide Shut. One of the things we haven't talked about. Wait. Before I move on, I was going to go to music because there's some really extraordinary music in this, but I want to go back to the cinematography for a second. And
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
and sorry everybody listening for what might feel like some whiplash like changes in topic here. It's like but I'm curious, you say it's one of your favorite films. I want to talk a little bit more about cinematography, because I know that that's an area you know a lot about. It's often an area of focus for you. You've got quite a bit of experience there. When I was watching the film, I think, first of all, I thought it was quite beautiful,
Hmm.
especially the way it's lit in its interiors. One thing I didn't realize or like think about until now: this is a Christmas movie.
It is. Yes.
So you
Yeah.
could
Yeah.
like add this to like, Die Hard. I mean, it's a Christmas movie,
Yeah.
amazing. But I can't imagine though, families like sitting down,
It's a
on
double
Christmas
feature
Eve.
with It's a Wonderful Life. I
That's
mean, two
awesome.
families come together at the end of each of them.
Yeah,
So, right?
there you go. There you go. Oh my gosh, yeah, that's awesome. But so I thought it was like really beautifully lit, and they used kind of like the Christmas setting, especially with the interiors, to have a lot of these like string lights. There's a lot of
Hmm.
color. Um, it's very warm in a lot of places, which I really appreciate. But I was surprised by how much Kubrick uses close-ups
Hmm.
in this film. You've got a lot of just top of head to practically chin, and I'm like kind of surprised, because I thought that was something that you didn't particularly like. I thought you liked a little bit wider, a little bit, but I'm curious like what your thoughts are about just the cinematography in
Well,
general, but
actually, no. Yeah, I
especially
do.
that.
I like that a lot. I like those shots. I also because they're impactful because you compare them to. There is a lot of like I think a lot of this movie is also shot on like those wide 9.8 millimeter lenses that he shot The Shining on. Like that whole party sequence at the beginning is like steady
Yeah,
cam,
but these
super wide.
close-ups, not these close-ups though of the
Yeah,
faces.
yeah, yeah. But even like when they're having like when Tom Cruise is with those models, like it's all kind of a wide oneer. But then when you get into those close-ups, it makes them so much more impactful because of how
I mean,
much
there's
we've
a
seen.
lot though. There's a
Yeah, yeah.
lot.
No, but I like it. I mean, I think again, it's
Okay.
like Kubrick. I think it depends on. It's not a totally black and white thing where it's like I never like a certain shot type. It just if it's done well and it looks
Yeah.
good, then it works for that moment.
I guess
Then
I feel like I've moved a little bit. I don't know. This is just me. This could just be me, or maybe you could help me articulate this better and illuminate my own thinking. But I almost feel like when I see just so many close-ups, I almost feel like I'm watching television. I just
mm-hmm.
I'm not saying I don't like. Oh no, don't ever use a close-up. I guess what I'm saying is like I try to think about using them more sparingly you know and I think you miss a lot when you've got close-ups like that
Mm-hmm.
and you're using kind of longer lenses. You lose all the background, you lose all there's no spatial orientation. We're also you can't really do anything with blocking now. You can't do anything with like staging depth, telling story with depth anymore in the frame. And and uh and so I feel like you lose a lot of like of the tools that could be available to you in the grammar of cinema when it's just close up, close up, close up, close up, close up. I almost feel like I'm watching like I don't mean to say like this is gonna be I'm not even gonna say what I was thinking. Because it would have been just so I mean so outrageous to compare a Kubrick film to like a student film that was shot on one of those first full frame Canon
Oh yeah, yeah,
cameras
yeah, yeah.
where everybody was like shooting like
Getting the shallowest depth of field. Yeah, yeah,
razor thin depth of field and just close-ups everywhere, and they're like, look at my bokeh, man.
yeah.
But I guess that's kind of just a little bit. I just feel like a lot of those tools are gone when it's just a lot of close up.
Yeah,
So
I think one thing that's interesting about Kubrick is that he is very matter of fact in the way that he presents images. Like he
yeah,
likes, and so I think that the one thing that I think works for me with those is that he'll often have a scene that where you see rather than cutting into a location, like you always see the characters enter the location,
mm,
and you always see them almost like take their perches for whatever is going to carry out here. And
yeah,
it's only until that or only when they actually like find their positions and begin these moments between each other that you have those like for example the when they're smoking pot and the pot is making Nicole Kidman very aggressive.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
You
yeah,
get that situation where it's like it's primarily done in wides until they kind of take like she sits on the floor
yeah,
and then he sits on the bed and then you
yeah.
have this like then it's close-ups.
Well,
Same
and
with
I
the
agree.
like Nick Nightingale in the nightclub where it's like you've got this wide of him entering the space and sitting down and then it's only until they start talking at the table that you land on those close-ups. And I think it's very like again he's very intentioned obviously with his framing in that way. And I think that it kind of to me it like
Well, and
it
that's how you
feels
would
almost
usually do it.
episodic to
That
me.
well, and that's where I'm saying it's like you would see that in television everywhere. That's I
Yeah,
guess my
yeah.
point is like I feel like you would because it's right. I mean, that's just like yes, start with the why, da da da, and then we move in. As the conversation kind of builds to whatever like climax of that particular scene is. Like now we're moving into close-ups, and then it's just close up, close up, close up, close up. And I guess like maybe I've just been watching so much older cinema lately where that just wasn't used anywhere near as often that you might have a whole conversation unfold in a wide and you would have very specific blocking where as character as the conversation changed and his power maybe shifted you would have a character blocking would be an integral part of that and so like the storytelling wouldn't just be told from left to right it would be told in the z-axis as well and you would have storytelling elements move to the foreground and
Yes,
background
yeah, yeah.
and I get and so maybe that's where I'm just coming from is that I've just been watching so much cinema from the 40s and 50s lately where it seems like that was a more widely used element
Mm-hmm.
Because you're usually shooting in 4:3, or you're often shooting in 4:3, and just it was more kind of, you would shoot with a lot more depth of focus, and you would be using a lot of that space, and the so maybe that's all, maybe that's what it
Mm-hmm.
is. I'm just kind of, but I do kind of feel in general that, not just with this film, and again, I'm not knocking this film's awesome, it's beautiful. I'm just kind of picking one little thing to kind of have a conversation about it. But I feel like so much cinema today is missing that, though, like that Z-axis storytelling,
Mm-hmm.
like, and really purposeful blocking that's part of the storytelling. It's like, go watch, like, All About Eve, or Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf,
Mm-hmm.
or Sweet Smell of Success. It's just so many films, and from the 60s too. And I just, you feel like so much more of that, and so much of that cinema. And that's, I almost feel like sometimes we just like, where's the Z-axis? And
Yeah.
anyway, I
No.
went off on a tangent again. I'm so sorry.
No, I don't. I can totally feel that though. Like I did. There's one shot of, um, when Nicole Kidman wakes up from that nightmare after Tom Cruise gets back from his first night out,
Yeah.
and she wakes up and she's talking about how like it was like the empty city and there were these men and blah
Mm-hmm.
blah blah. And as soon as you left, I felt so at ease. Blah. And that shot, it's like a really slow kind of like push or zoom in, I think it is, on Kidman giving that speech, and it ends up landing basically on like a close up of her. Um, I remember watching that and thinking, like, trying, like, I was sitting there kind of thinking last night when I was watching it, um, if I was looking at that, like if I was sitting on set and I was directing this and that was the shot, like I'd set up the camera and I looked through the viewfinder and I saw that
Uh-huh.
shot,
Uh-huh.
I was like, would I feel like that is too uninteresting and try and move the camera or do
Mm.
something else with it to
Mm.
make it more interesting? And I think
Mm.
that kind of brought me around to this conclusion of just like, yeah, but I think Kubrick is just not, like, for a moment like this, I think he's just completely uninterested in making a shot like superfluously visually appealing for what it is, where it's just like, it's so matter of fact, like it's her talking, it's them
Yeah.
waking up and her talking. And I think that Kubrick is just so matter of fact in these ways that he's
Yeah.
just like, why do I need to do anything different? Like it's her talking. And it's like, and I find that
Hmm.
very thing is really fascinating, because while I might not, like, while to me there's nothing, I have nothing against making shots beautiful and every shot beautiful. Again, Malick is like one of my favorite filmmakers of all time, and all of his shots are so organic
Well,
and
and don't misunderstand. I
lifelike.
mean,
And
like, everything is motivated. Like, I just want
yes,
to
yeah, yeah,
like, I'm not
absolutely, yeah,
talking
yeah.
about like floating the camera all over the place just for the hell of it.
No,
Matter
of
of fact,
course, yeah, yeah,
I'm actually even kind of talking more about like the camera actually being, longer takes,
yeah,
wider shots, and like actually things happening within the frame is what I'm actually talking
yeah.
about.
No, no,
So,
exactly,
okay.
yeah, yeah. And that's what I mean, is that it's I think just very, again, like it's very very matter of fact. It's very
Yeah.
what you see on frame. Like Kubrick is very much almost sort of like in a bit of a, like, I know Hitchcock obviously moved the camera a ton and was very famous for his camera movement, but in a kind of, I almost see it in sort of a similar way though, where like Hitchcock was somebody who, if you walk into a room and the light switch is important to the character, you cut to the light switch, right? Like
Yeah.
that's the next shot, is the person walks in the room and then they
Insert.
look at the light
Yep.
switch and you get an insert of that light switch. And
Yep.
that's not necessarily what Kubrick's doing here. He's not like doing that exact literal thing, but what he is sort of doing in that sort of, I think, same like headspace, is like he's just presenting a scene. Like he's presenting an
Mm.
image without intentionally trying to put on much visual flair to tell that story, and rather just kind of is like planting the camera down and letting these events take place
Yeah.
and shooting it in quite a standard way, I think, to, again, I don't know, he died before the movie came out, so it will forever be a mystery as to like some of the
Yeah.
decisions he made, because he unfortunately never got to talk about them. But my guess would just be that he wants the movie to feel, I think that this goes with the sort of the tone of the movie as well, I think, though, where it sort of feels like banal, like that even though Cruise is in these like wildly fantastical situations and winds up at a bizarre sex cult orgy in the
Yeah.
middle of the night, um, it's still portrayed so matter of fact and so
Mm.
like like this is just the goings on, and he feels very out of place. But it almost is like, as he walks through that space, he's just observing stuff. Like he's just like, okay, what's this? What's this? What's this? And so I think that that's kind of at least where I get the sensation of like not a ton being done with the camera in like a very like kinetic way. I don't know. I feel like that's kind of where it comes from. It's just a feeling of banality and like portraying these very bizarre events as something very ordinary.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah, and that's just a guess on my part. Like that's just
Yeah.
me ruminating
Well,
on
and
it.
I think through other ways, right? Through that, whether it's like the rear projection, shooting on backlot, it's the lighting is very dreamy, right? I mean, utilizing all of the string lights and the glow and the interiors of these spaces. There's a lot done through costumes, obviously. Those masks, I mean, it's just brilliant costume work done. Those masks are just freaking terrifying to me, dude.
Yeah, the
I
Venetian
mean,
masks. Yeah.
I mean, it's like like there's like no horror movie hardly I've ever seen that's like scarier,
Yeah.
and I mean, seriously. And then, which is a great segue into another aspect of this film, which is like adds to this like terrifying, ominous, feeling, is the music. I mean, especially in those scenes, that like atmospheric, like backmaster, like the backwards playing. What is it? I think like one of the pieces, there's like a Romanian Orthodox like sermon being delivered or something that is then
played
backwards over this like and then there's I think another piece or something that's like
it's a Tamil song, like a Tamil prayer.
And just like it sounds so alien, it's so effective, and the music that is put with that is just, I mean, and the piano, the solitary like hammering away at just a single keys. It's like, oh man, sends chills down my spine.
And it's just I actually like I have a few of the songs from the soundtrack on my phone because I just think it's such a Jocelyn Pook,
it's like your gym music.
Yeah, exactly. It's great to, if you're ever out late at night walking downtown in a city or something, it's
and
great
you want to scare
on.
the crap out of yourself.
But I think that even there's two pieces that are primarily strings, which is like the Dream and Naval Officer, which is what the title that they're called in the soundtrack. And those are when Nicole Kidman is talking about her fantasy, and then the dream afterwards as well. And it's like this kind of like building strings sound where like the strings just keep coming on and Kubrick plays them actually so quietly in the mix that it's kind of difficult to hear how intense they are, but when you listen to them on their own, it's actually like they're actually quite loud pieces.
Interesting.
And so I find it really fascinating that Kubrick played them so quietly, because they work perfectly. Like the level that they're played in the film works completely perfectly. But no, I think that she does such a brilliant job, and she still you can still find Jocelyn Pook doing a million things, really fascinating things online.
Wow.
But she, I think, just like that music in the like the cult scenes and all that is so I guess it's not really a cult, it's like a society, whatever. It is so, it's like almost bizarre though, because it's not using like that Romanian Orthodox, the liturgy that's played in reverse is not the progressions of the chord, I think is primarily in a major key. Like it's not necessarily typical horror movie music that you would hear where it's like all minor key and all scary, and it's like it's like actually quite, I think, removed from the context. Like it can actually be almost beautiful in a very like kind of uncanny way. But paired with the bizarreness of the film and the context in which it's in, and the fact that it all feels so dreamlike, where it's like, and it's played backwards, where you're just, it's such a movie, and the soundtrack absolutely enforces this, that deals in feeling so much more in dealing with the literal. And I think that that's what's really, really foundational about the soundtrack, and what works so well about it is just that it's like the vibe of the moment.
It's just all these
dictates
little,
how you kind of take away from it.
Right, and I think I agree with you, and I think it work. There's like all these. It's just these perversions, right? It's like you take take the vocalizations, let's play them backward and pervert that. let's take like beautiful, people and put these like horrific masks on them. Let's, everything is disassociated. Everything is twisted. Everything is like, this is the dark side of all these things. And so I think that music just that backmasking works, just perfectly there. And it falls like in line so beautifully with the reinforcement of that theme, or that kind of like series of themes of just disassociation, dehumanization, the shadow kind of perverted dark side of something,
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean it's scary to me. Like,
Yeah.
I'm just straight up, I haven't listened to it like outside of the context of the film, because I've just never, I never had the feeling of like, oh, I'm gonna like rock out to this like particular track of music.
It's
right
honestly,
now.
it's a great writing.
But I'll have to
soundtrack,
try.
I
Yeah,
find. Like it,
I'll have to check it out. Like in a very brightly lit, like open, safe space. I will check that out.
yeah, yes. Not on
Oh
any
my
sort of psychedelic. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Oh, what are like, well, you had mentioned like, all alone by yourself in like a dark like city street or something. I'm like, no, I'm not putting that music on then. No, thank you. No way. Wow. Well, this has been like an extraordinarily interesting conversation. Any last words or anything that you'd like to touch base on before we
No,
say
I think
goodbye?
I think we've covered all the bases.
We've
Really, I
covered,
think
yeah.
it's a great
I mean,
conversation.
obviously, many conversations could be had about this film, clearly, but we hope that all of you listening enjoyed this one. I enjoyed discussing it. And thanks for picking it. I hadn't thought about this film in a while, so it was interesting to revisit it now, so many years later. All right. Well, I guess I've got to scratch my head and pick my film for our next episode. But until then, everybody, thanks for listening. We are grateful that you do, and we will catch you on the flip side.
Yeah. Bye bye.